They called me thorough. In the Ordo Xenos archive on Cypermundi, thoroughness was survival. I had cataloged 3 years of sinological threat assessments, cross-referenced inquisitorial observations against actual fleet movements, maintained the greatest repository of Tyranid behavioral data in Segmentum Tempestus. My work helped the Imperium understand the Great Devourer. My supervisor said my dedication would save worlds. I believed him. I believed the patterns I documented proved we were winning, that our defenses mattered, that humanity's struggle had meaning. My name is Serath Kaine, and I want you to understand. I loved my work before I understood what it meant. The archive occupied 17 subterranean levels beneath the fortress of vigilant stars. I worked in Vault Secundus, temperature maintained at 11 degrees to preserve parchment and prevent data, slate decay. The cold kept you alert. The cold kept the records intact. The cold made you grateful for the heated tea dispensary on the 3rd sublevel, where you could wrap your fingers around synthetic ceramic and feel almost human for 8 minutes between processing sessions. My routine began when the morning bells tolled 6 times. I would descend through security checkpoint Theta, submit to retinal scan and gene sampling, recite the litany of unwavering purpose while the servitor verified my credentials. The servitor's augmetic jaw clicked when it spoke, vocal synthesizer producing the same phrase for 30 years. Clearance confirmed. The Emperor protects. I always responded with the proper counter, phrase, through knowledge, vigilance. Through vigilance, survival. I processed between 40 and 60 files daily. Each document detailed Tyranid encounters, fleet vectors, biological adaptation patterns, consumption rates, hive ship classifications, synaptic creature behavioral models. The work demanded absolute precision. A single transcription error could send battle groups to the wrong coordinates, misallocate resources, doom entire sectors. I took pride in my accuracy. In 11 years, I had logged only 2 minor discrepancies, both corrected within the same shift. The files came in leather, bound dossiers, edges reinforced with brass corners bearing the inquisitorial seal. Each morning, the pneumatic tube delivered between 8 and 12 dossiers with a soft pneumatic hiss. I would arrange them chronologically, verify the requisition seals, begin processing according to the Administratum standard processing protocols. I logged incident date, location coordinates, fleet designation, estimated biomass consumed, Imperial casualties, outcome classification. The forms had 47 distinct fields. I filled every one. I believed in the forms. They represented order imposed on chaos, human comprehension wrestling, meaning from alien hunger. Every data point I entered became part of humanity's collective understanding. Every pattern I identified might save lives. The archive held 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge, and I was its custodian, its translator, its faithful servant. My station was Desk 17 in Row Tertius. The desk surface bore scratches from previous archivists, generations of faithful service worn into the wood. To my left sat Archivist Felton, who specialized in orc behavioral patterns and hummed hymns while he worked. To my right was Archivist Morvain, who processed Necron awakening reports and never spoke except to quote scripture. We maintained professional silence during processing hours broke only for the noon devotional when we would stand, bow toward the Emperor's shrine in the vault's eastern alcove, recite the prayer of dutiful service in unison. The prayer was 37 words long. I had recited it 4,914 times. I knew exactly how many because I had logged every working day in my personal devotional journal, a practice my supervisor commended during my annual performance review. He said my faith made my work exceptional. He said the Emperor's light shined through my diligence. He said I was exactly what the Imperium needed: thorough, faithful, unquestioning. I was proud of that assessment. Pride in service is not heresy when properly directed. The Munitorum Manual of Proper Thought. Section 12, subsection 8. Pride in dutiful execution of assigned function honors the Emperor and strengthens the Imperium. I had memorized the entire manual during my first year. I referenced it frequently. It provided certainty when the work grew difficult, when the casualty numbers climbed into the millions, when entire worlds vanished from the registry. The numbers were always vast. Tyranid consumption operated on scales that defied human comprehension. When Hive Fleet Leviathan struck the Octaria sector, preliminary estimates suggested 8 billion casualties. When Hive Fleet Kraken devoured the Eledian cluster, the death toll exceeded 40 billion. These numbers appeared in my reports as simple notation: 8,000 Zalausen, and 40 Zalausen, just digits. Just necessary documentation of the Great Devourer's hunger. I processed them without emotion because emotion compromised accuracy. The Munitorum Manual, Section 4, subsection 15. Excessive emotional response to documented casualties indicates insufficient mental discipline and may suggest psychological instability requiring evaluation. I remained stable. I remained disciplined. I logged the numbers and moved to the next file. The archive maintained strict protocols for document handling. We wore white cotton gloves to prevent skin oil contamination. We used only approved archival ink, formula designation 730-4, manufactured on Mars to specifications unchanged since M36. We recorded observations in precise script, 12 words per line, 28 lines per page. Standardization ensured consistency across centuries of documentation. My handwriting was exemplary. Supervisor Kadris had said so during 3 consecutive annual reviews. He compared my script to the ancient master archivists, said my letter forms showed proper devotion to tradition. I practiced calligraphy during my rest periods, perfecting the curved flourish of the Imperial Aquila above each page's heading. The Aquila represented everything I served: strength, vigilance, humanity's refusal to surrender before the darkness. I believed the Aquila would protect us. I believed our documentation mattered because knowledge was humanity's weapon. The Tyranids were beasts driven by hunger, but we were humans guided by reason. Every file I processed added to our strategic understanding. Every pattern I identified helped the War Masters plan defensive strategies. My work saved lives. That belief sustained me through the cold, through the repetition, through the endless documentation of worlds lost to the swarm. The day the first doubt appeared, I was processing file dossier Delta 1741. The incident involved Hive Fleet Jormungandr's approach toward the Drusen subsector. The file was standard format, 47 fields properly filled, investigation report attached with proper authentication seals. The fleet had been detected at the subsector's edge, 3 months from the nearest inhabited world. The Imperial response was immediate: full civilian evacuation, systematic scorched, Earth resource denial, complete infrastructural destruction. Standard procedure. The Tyranids consumed biomass. Deny them biomass, deny them strength. The strategy was outlined in the Tactica Imperialis, Chapter 88. Against the Devourer, render all worlds barren before their approach. Better ashes than assimilation. I had read that chapter 19 times. I understood the logic. Sacrifice the present to preserve the future. But something in the file caught my attention. I almost missed it, because it appeared in the supplementary investigation annexes, those dense appendices that most archivists skimmed for relevant data points. I read every appendix. Thoroughness was survival. The investigation report, compiled by Magos Biologus Verton Cross, contained an observation that made me pause. The report was 73 pages, mostly technical analysis of Tyranid vanguard organism behavior patterns. On page 68, buried in a subsection about fleet trajectory modeling, Magos Cross noted, Hive Fleet Jormungandr maintains consistent heading despite substantial course correction opportunities that would provide access to higher density biomass clusters. Fleet trajectory appears deliberately maintained rather than opportunistically adjusted. Behavior pattern inconsistent with standard consumption optimization models. I reread the passage 3 times. Then I checked the Imperial response section. Drussen subsector, population 470 million across 8 worlds. Total evacuation initiated 60 days before estimated fleet arrival. Evacuation completion rate 17%. Remaining civilian population 390 million souls. Sector rendered barren through systematic Promethean bombardment. Infrastructure destroyed. Biosphere rendered inhospitable. Outcome classification strategic success, denial operation complete. The fleet arrived 11 weeks later than projected. It swept through the dead worlds, found nothing to consume, altered course toward the galactic rim. 390 million people, incinerated to deny the swarm biomass it might never have prioritized. But Magos Cross had noted the fleet's behavior seemed deliberate rather than opportunistic. What did that mean? I marked the file for additional review, a yellow notation strip that indicated potential pattern relevance for future analysis. It was proper procedure when encountering unusual data. I moved to the next file. But the question remained, a small seed of unease that I tried to suppress through devotional prayer during the midday break. The second incident occurred 6 days later. I was processing files from the Orpheus Salient. 3 years of documentation following Hive Fleet Leviathan's incursion. The files detailed defensive operations, resource allocation, casualty reports, strategic assessments, standard documentation, familiar territory. File Delta 2319 concerned the world of Asphodex Prime, a minor agri world that provided grain shipments to 17 neighboring systems. The planet's population was 9 million, almost entirely concentrated in 3 equatorial hive cities. The Tyranid approach was detected 4 months before estimated arrival. Evacuation was deemed non-essential. The world would be defended in place using standard Imperial Guard deployments. The defense lasted 8 days. The Tyranids consumed 92% of the planetary biomass, including 8.7 million human casualties. The planet was rendered uninhabitable. Classification, strategic failure, total loss. But in the intelligence assessment attached to the file, I found something that connected to Magos Cross's observation. The assessment, compiled by Inquisitor Velmora of the Ordo Xenos, included fleet movement analysis. She wrote, Hive Fleet Leviathan's approach to Asphodex Prime followed a trajectory that bypassed the resource-dense moons of the Thiralian Belt. Despite those moons containing substantially greater biomass concentrations than the target world, the fleet maintained its approach vector without deviation. This behavior has been observed in 17 other documented encounters and suggests non-random target selection inconsistent with pure consumption drive models. 17 other encounters, non-random target selection. The Tyranids were not simply following the scent of biomass like beasts tracking prey. They were choosing specific targets despite better alternatives. I pulled my personal research journal from the desk's locked drawer, began cross-referencing the observation against my memory of previous files. The journal was unofficial, a personal project I maintained to help identify broader patterns. Supervisor Kadris knew about it, had even praised my initiative during my last review. I flipped through 300 pages of careful notation, looking for similar observations. I found 8. 8 separate files across 2 years where investigating officials had noted Tyranid fleets maintaining courses that seemed strategically chosen rather than opportunistically pursued. The observations appeared in supplementary sections, always qualified with phrases like "requires further analysis" or "pattern significance unclear." No one had connected them. No one had seen what these 8 reports suggested when viewed together. The Tyranids were not random. They were selecting targets according to criteria that had nothing to do with maximizing immediate biomass consumption. I logged the observation in my journal, noted the file references, prepared to submit a pattern analysis report to Supervisor Kadris during our weekly coordination meeting. This was important. If the Tyranids were employing strategic targeting rather than opportunistic feeding, our defensive models were based on flawed assumptions. Resources were being allocated incorrectly. Worlds were being sacrificed unnecessarily. That night, I lay in my hab, unit 3 kilometers above the archive, staring at the corrugated steel ceiling, unable to sleep. The heating system clicked and rattled, cycling through its programmed sequence every 47 minutes. Outside, the city of Castellum Mortis hummed with nocturnal activity, manufactorum night shifts, patrol vehicles. The endless machinery of Imperial administration. I thought about 390 million people burning on Drussen. I thought about Hive Fleet Jormungandr maintaining its course, despite better opportunities. I thought about the phrase, non-random target selection. What were the Tyranids selecting for? What patterns governed their consumption? The questions felt dangerous. Questions implied doubt. Doubt was the first step toward heresy. The Munitorum Manual, Section 1, Subsection 3. The faithful servant trusts in the wisdom of their superiors and questions not the Emperor's design. I had memorized that passage during my first week of service. But I was not questioning the Emperor's design. I was questioning our understanding of the enemy. There was a difference. Wasn't there? Sleep came eventually, thin and troubled. When the morning bells tolled 6 times, I rose, performed my ablutions, recited the prayer of dutiful awakening, descended to Vault Secundus with the pattern questions still circling through my thoughts like scavenger birds over carrion. The third incident arrived in my morning delivery file Delta 2836 concerning the Valdor system. The file was thick, nearly 200 pages of documentation spanning a 6-month period. The Valdor system contained 7 worlds, 3 inhabited. Total population 123 million. Hive Fleet Kronos had entered the system 5 years previous. Consumed 2 of the inhabited worlds completely, then departed despite the third world remaining untouched and viable. The third world was Valdor Prime, population 78 million, major administratum data, processing center, repository for 14 subsector governance archives. The Tyranids had swept past it without investigation, despite its substantial biomass and the documented Tyranid tendency to prioritize dense population centers. The investigation report, filed by Inquisitor Castron Vol, was unusually detailed. Inquisitor Vol had personally supervised the system survey after the Tyranid departure, trying to determine why Valdor Prime was spared. His conclusion, stated on page 147 with unusual directness: no natural explanation exists for the fleet's bypass of Valdor Prime. The world contained optimal biomass density, accessible approach vectors, and negligible defensive capacity. The fleet demonstrated clear awareness of the world's presence through multiple scout organism deployments, yet initiated no consumption action. The bypass appears to be deliberate strategic choice rather than oversight or environmental factor. Deliberate strategic choice. The Inquisitor had used those exact words. Not possible oversight. Not explained by defense capabilities. Deliberate choice. But the file contained something else that made my hands grow cold despite the vault's heated gloves. Attached to the investigation report was a secondary document, an administratum emergency requisition form authorizing immediate data archive evacuation from Valdor Prime to secure facilities on Terra. The form was dated 3 months before Hive Fleet Chronos entered the system, before any Tyranid presence had been detected. Someone had ordered the archives evacuated before the threat arrived. Someone had known the system would be attacked, but that Valdor Prime would be bypassed. I checked the form's authorization signature. It was properly sealed, correctly formatted, bore all appropriate authentication codes. The authorizing official was Lord Administrator Hassender Vrock of the Segmentum Tempestus Administratum Command. I recognized the name. Vrock was one of the highest-ranking administrative officials in the entire Segmentum, answerable only to the Segmentum Commander and through him to the High Lords of Terra. How had Vrock known? How had he predicted, with 3 months advance certainty, exactly which world in a 7-planet system would be bypassed by an unpredictable swarm organism? My training said to document and report. My instinct said to remain silent. The conflict between those two imperatives created a physical sensation like cold water running down my spine. I sat at desk 17. The file opened before me, aware that Archivist Felton hummed hymns. To my left, and Archivist Morvain breathed softly to my right, and neither of them had noticed anything unusual because nothing was unusual in the way the administratum defined unusual. A high-ranking official had evacuated archives before a Tyranid attack. The Tyranids had attacked exactly as predicted, bypassing exactly the world predicted. This suggested either prophetic ability or foreknowledge of Tyranid intentions. The Imperium possessed neither. Therefore, something was wrong with my understanding of the situation. I processed the rest of the file mechanically, filling all 47 fields with perfect precision while my mind worked through the implications. When the file was complete, I added it to my personal journal's cross-reference system, noted the connection to the previous pattern observations, prepared to submit all findings to Supervisor Cadres during our scheduled meeting. The meeting occurred 3 days later in Cadres's administrative office on sublevel 4. The office was warmer than the vaults, maintained at 18 degrees for human comfort. Cadres sat behind a plasteel desk bearing 3 data slates, a sealed tea service, and a small shrine containing a finger bone allegedly from Saint Celestine herself, preserved in amber and blessed by the ecclesiarchy. He gestured for me to sit, poured 2 cups of tea from the service with the ritualized precision that characterized all his movements. Cadres was 67 years old by standard Imperial reckoning, had served in the Ordo Xenos archive for 41 years, knew more about xenological threat documentation than any other living archivist in Segmentum Tempestus. His face was lined like old parchment, eyes sharp behind wire, frame spectacles that he refused to replace with augmetic enhancement. He said organic eyes read nuance better than manufactured sensors. I believed him. I believed everything he said. I presented my findings methodically, the 26 files showing non-random Tyranid targeting, the pattern of strategic selection over opportunistic consumption, the Valdor Prime anomaly, the prescient archive evacuation. I had prepared a summary document, 8 pages of careful analysis with cited references. I placed it on his desk with both hands, a gesture of formal submission. Cadres read the document completely before speaking. The silence lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I counted each second, heart beating faster than normal despite my attempts at meditative calm. When Cadres finally looked up, his expression was tired. Not surprised. Tired. He removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a cloth he kept in his desk drawer, replaced them with deliberate care. "You are thorough, Serath," he said. His voice carried something I had never heard before, resignation. Thorough enough to find patterns that most archivists never notice. Thorough enough to ask questions that have no comfortable answers. He poured more tea, offered me the cup. I accepted it, wrapped my fingers around the ceramic, felt warmth seeping into my palms. "I have worked in this archive for 41 years. Kadris continued. "I have processed 37,000 files concerning xenological threats. Do you know what I have learned in those 41 years? I shook my head, unable to speak. I have learned that the Imperium does not reward curiosity. I have learned that patterns exist, which must be documented but not discussed. I have learned that some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked." He reached into his desk drawer, withdrew a small leather-bound journal similar to my own. He placed it on the desk between us. "This contains my observations from 30 years of pattern analysis. Observations very similar to yours. I never submitted them formally. I documented them for my own understanding, then filed them away, because I understood what submitting them would mean." "What would it mean?" The words came out as a whisper. Kadris looked at me with something approaching pity. "It would mean investigation. Investigation would mean scrutiny of your loyalty. Scrutiny would mean questioning why you doubt the Imperium's strategic understanding. Questioning would become suspicion. Suspicion would become accusation. You are thorough, Serath. Thorough enough to understand where that chain leads." I understood. The Imperium did not tolerate doubt, even doubt aimed at improving effectiveness. Doubt was heresy's first symptom. Questions were the doorway to corruption. The Munitorum Manual, Section 1, Subsection 7, "The servant who questions serves only himself, not the Emperor." "But if the patterns are real," I said, forcing the words through a throat that wanted to remain silent. "If the Tyranids are selecting targets strategically rather than opportunistically, then our defensive models are wrong. Worlds are dying that might be saved. Resources are being wasted. We could save lives if we understood." "No." Kadris's voice was gentle but absolute. "We could not. Because the Imperium's understanding of the Tyranid threat is not based on incomplete data. It is based on complete data that we choose to interpret in specific ways." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. I set down my tea, no longer able to feel its warmth. "What does that mean?" Kadris was quiet for 37 seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried 4 decades of accumulated wariness. "It means that the questions you are asking have been asked before, by people far more powerful than either of us. It means those questions have been answered. It means the answers are classified at levels neither you nor I will ever access. It means we document what we are told to document, process what we are told to process, and do not examine the patterns too closely, because the patterns are part of a strategy that extends far beyond our comprehension." "But 390 million people died on Drussan," I said. "Died. Burning worlds the Tyranids might never have prioritized. If there's a pattern, if there's understanding that could prevent that, then that understanding exists at levels of command that have determined the current approach is optimal." Kadris's voice remained gentle, but beneath the gentleness lay something harder. "The High Lords of Terra have access to information we do not. The Inquisition maintains intelligence networks we cannot imagine. Strategic decisions are made by those who see the entire board, not those who process individual pieces. We are archivists, Serath. We document. We do not command." He picked up my 8-page analysis, held it for a moment, then placed it in his desk drawer alongside his own journal. "I will file this in my personal records," he said. I will not submit it to higher authority. I will not mention your questions in my reports. You will return to your station, continue your excellent work, and understand that some patterns are not meant to be assembled. It was not a suggestion. It was a command wrapped in fatherly concern, and beneath the concern was an implicit threat. Continue this path, and you will be removed from your position. Removed from your position meant investigation. Investigation meant questioning. Questioning meant I stood, bowed properly, recited the formal acknowledgement. By the Emperor's will, I serve faithfully. Yes, Kadris said quietly. You do, and faithful service means trusting that those above us see what we cannot. I left his office, descended to Vault Secundus, returned to Desk 17. Archivist Felton hummed his hymns. Archivist Morvain breathed softly. The pneumatic tubes delivered the morning files with their familiar hiss. I processed 43 documents that day, filled every field with perfect precision, logged every detail with unwavering accuracy. I did not mention the patterns again, but I could not stop seeing them. Over the following months, I developed a private methodology. I processed files according to protocol during working hours, but I maintained careful personal records in my locked journal. I documented every instance of non-random Tyranid targeting. I noted every case where Imperial decisions seemed to anticipate Tyranid actions. I collected the anomalies like someone collecting evidence for a trial that would never occur. The patterns grew clearer. Hive Fleet Behemoth had struck Ultramar with devastating force, consuming hundreds of worlds, yet had bypassed the Forge world of Metallica despite its proximity and massive population. Why? Metallica was an ancient and irreplaceable center of weapons manufacturing. Its loss would have crippled Imperial military production across the entire eastern fringe. The Tyranids had ignored it. Hive Fleet Kraken had swept through the Elydian cluster, devouring 43 inhabited worlds, yet had mysteriously altered course to avoid the shrine world of Blessed Martyr. The deviation required substantial energy expenditure for course correction. The shrine world contained 53 million pilgrims, concentrated in dense population centers, easily accessible. The fleet had spent resources to avoid it. Hive Fleet Leviathan had consumed its way toward the Octarius sector, where the Orcs had established a massive empire. The Inquisition had deliberately allowed the two forces to collide, creating an eternal war that contained both threats. The Tyranids could have bypassed Octarius entirely, found easier feeding grounds elsewhere. Instead, they had engaged the Orcs in a conflict that had lasted decades, consuming their strength against one of the galaxy's most resilient species. Each pattern suggested the same conclusion. The Tyranids were being directed toward specific targets and away from others. The targeting criteria were consistent. Worlds with critical infrastructure were bypassed. Shrine worlds were avoided. Strategic resources were left intact, but populated worlds without critical importance were devoured without mercy. Someone was controlling the swarm. Not completely. Not with absolute precision, but with enough influence to shape their general path through the galaxy. And the Imperium knew. Had to know. Because the Imperial responses consistently anticipated outcomes that should have been unpredictable. I processed these thoughts during my working hours, maintained my perfect accuracy, recited my prayers, performed my devotions. At night, I lay in my HAB unit and stared at the ceiling, trying to reconcile faithful service with growing certainty that faithful service meant complicity in something I did not understand. The breakthrough came 11 months after my conversation with Supervisor Kadris. It arrived in File Delta 4792, a report concerning the Cryptus system, where Hive Fleet Leviathan had encountered the Necron Sautek dynasty in sustained conflict. The file was 673 3 pages, compiled over 18 months of observation by multiple inquisitorial investigators. Buried on page 430, one was a communication intercept. The intercept was not from Tyranid biosignals or Necron command protocols. It was Imperial, a decoded astropathic transmission between two unidentified sources, designated only as Vermilion and Obsidian. The transmission read, Leviathan containment maintaining projected parameters. Tech engagement consuming primary tendrils as calculated. Strategic bleed achieving desired population reduction in tertiary systems while preserving critical infrastructure. Estimate 43% total biomass reduction in contested sectors. Acceptable losses. Maintain vector manipulation through standard protocols. Coordinate with other fleets for comprehensive coverage. I read the intercept 7 times. Each word was precise, clinical, administrative. The language of logistics applied to apocalyptic war. Vector manipulation. Strategic bleed. Acceptable losses. The transmission treated Tyranid fleet movements as controllable variables in a vast equation. The intercept was dated 2 years previous. It bore authentication codes suggesting Lord Inquisitor level clearance. And it was filed in the archive without redaction, as if its presence was deliberate, as if someone wanted it preserved even if not widely distributed. I sat at desk 17, surrounded by centuries of accumulated documentation, and understood that I was reading a confession hidden in plain sight. The Imperium was not fighting the Tyranids. The Imperium was using them. My hands began to shake. I pressed them flat against the desk, forced myself to breathe slowly, maintained composure, while my entire understanding of reality restructured itself around this single piece of evidence. The Tyranids were not the great existential threat to humanity. They were a tool. A weapon aimed at the Imperium's own population, designed to create permanent crisis, justify absolute control, eliminate billions while preserving essential infrastructure. The Imperium was complicit. No, not complicit. Actively managing. The swarms were being guided like attack dogs on invisible leashes, pointed at targets selected for strategic value. Population reduction. Those 2 words contained multitudes of horror. Billions consumed not because consumption was inevitable, but because consumption was desired. 390 million burning on Drussen not despite better, Tyranid targeting options, but because Drussen's population was expendable. 8 million deaths on Asphodex Prime, not from strategic failure, but from strategic success in reducing numbers while maintaining terror. The math became clear with sickening precision. The Imperium controlled 1 million worlds, each with populations ranging from millions to hundreds of billions. Managing those populations required resources, food, security, administration. But if periodic crises eliminated the least productive populations while preserving critical infrastructure, the administrative burden decreased while control increased. Fear unified populations. External threats justified authoritarian measures. The Tyranid swarms were population control operating at galactic scale. I thought of every file I had processed over 11 years. 47,000 documents of careful observation, pattern analysis, casualty reports. I had documented hundreds of encounters, logged billions of deaths, maintained perfect records of an engineered holocaust presented as defensive war. I had been complicit, not through malice, but through faithful service. I had believed the forms mattered, that accurate documentation served humanity's survival. I had taken pride in my thoroughness, my precision, my unwavering dedication to record keeping. I had been a cog in machinery designed to legitimize slaughter through administrative process. The realization broke something fundamental inside my chest. Not my heart, but whatever organ contained certainty, faith, trust in the Emperor's design. I sat at desk 17 while that organ ruptured, felt belief bleeding out through psychological wounds that no prayer could cauterize. To my left, Archivist Felton hummed his hymns. To my right, Archivist Morvain breathed softly. The morning files arrived through pneumatic tubes with their familiar hiss. Everything continued normally because nothing was abnormal in the way the administratum defined abnormal. This was the system functioning as designed. I finished processing file Delta 4792 with perfect accuracy. Logged all relevant data in appropriate fields, sealed it for permanent archive storage. Then I added detailed notes to my personal journal. Cross-referenced the intercept against every pattern I had documented over the previous year. The connections assembled themselves like puzzle pieces sliding into predetermined positions. I needed to verify. One intercept could be misunderstood, could be falsified, could mean something other than what it appeared to mean. I needed more evidence before accepting conclusions that would shatter my entire worldview. I was still an archivist. Evidence mattered. Over the next 3 months, I developed a secondary processing methodology. During official working hours, I processed files according to protocol. During the 2-hour lunch period, when most archivists returned to their HAB units, I remained in the vault and accessed historical records outside my normal assignment scope. The archive's classification system allowed cross-referencing if you understood the filing structure. I understood it perfectly. I pulled files from 15 years previous, 20 years, 30, 50. I traced Tyranid fleet movements backward through time, compared them against Imperial strategic decisions, looked for patterns of anticipation that suggested foreknowledge. The evidence accumulated like sedimentary layers of horror, each stratum revealing the same conclusion. The Imperium had known about Tyranid approach vectors before official detection. Evacuation orders were consistently filed weeks or months before threats materialized. Resource denial operations were positioned precisely to shape fleet movements. Defensive deployments were scaled not to population value, but to strategic manipulation requirements. The entire defensive architecture was designed not to stop the Tyranids, but to guide them. I found 23 more intercepted communications similar to the Vermilion, Obsidian transmission. They appeared across different time periods, different sectors, different hive fleets. All used similar language. Vector manipulation, containment protocols, acceptable losses, strategic bleed. All bore high-level inquisitorial authentication. All were filed in the archive as if their presence was routine documentation rather than evidence of vast conspiracy. The Inquisition was not fighting the Tyranids. The Inquisition was conducting the largest mass murder operation in human history, while maintaining the illusion of defensive war. And the archive, my beloved archive with its centuries of faithful documentation, was the administrative record of that crime. I began to notice other details that had previously seemed unremarkable. The archive received regular inspections from inquisitorial staff, standard security protocols to verify information integrity. But the inspectors always spent extensive time in specific sections. Files concerning planetary evacuations, casualty assessment methodologies, strategic resource allocation during crisis response. They were not verifying data accuracy. They were ensuring certain patterns remained documented but unrecognized. Supervisor Kadris had known. His personal journal, mentioned during our conversation, surely contained similar discoveries. How many other archivists across how many decades had assembled these patterns, recognized their meaning, then filed them away in personal records, rather than submit them for official review? How many of us participated in documenting atrocity while convincing ourselves that faithful service justified our complicity? The Munitorum Manual, Section 12, Subsection 8, which I had memorized and believed, Pride in dutiful execution of assigned function honors the Emperor and strengthens the Imperium. The phrase took on darker meaning now. Dutiful execution. Not just performance of assigned work, but execution in both senses. Every file I processed documented execution. Mass execution, populations eliminated through engineered crisis. I continued my work with mechanical precision, while my faith disintegrated like parchment exposed to flame. I maintained perfect attendance, met all processing quotas, received commendations for accuracy. At night I lay awake calculating casualty numbers, trying to comprehend scale that exceeded human cognitive capacity. 17 billion on Asphodex Prime. 470 million on Drusen. 850 million in the Cryptus system. 3 billion in the Valder incident. The numbers accumulated like grains of sand, filling an infinite hourglass. Each grain representing a life consumed by policy rather than necessity. The emotional weight became physically manifested. I lost 11 kilograms over 2 months. Food tasted like ash. Sleep came in fragmented intervals, punctuated by dreams of burning worlds, of transmission intercepts, of forms with blank fields labeled justification. I began using stimulants to maintain alertness during processing. Standard issue from the Medicaid dispensary, prescribed for archivists working extended documentation projects. The irony did not escape me. I was medicating myself to maintain participation in documenting genocide. Archivist Felton noticed my deterioration. He approached me during a rest period, placed a hand on my shoulder with genuine concern. "You look unwell, Serath. The work weighs heavily on you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him by his vestments and shake him, and demand to know how he could hum hymns while processing files that documented engineered atrocity. Instead, I nodded, offered a wan smile, said, "Just tired. I will pray for strength." "Prayer sustains us," he said kindly. "The Emperor provides endurance for those who serve faithfully." He believed it. Absolutely, completely believed it. And I envied him his faith with an intensity that felt like physical hunger. To believe again would be mercy. To unsee what I had seen was impossible. The breaking point arrived on a morning that began like any other. The bells tolled 6 times. I descended through security checkpoint Theta, submitted to retinal scan and gene sampling, recited the litany of unwavering purpose. The servitor's augmetic jaw clicked. Clearance confirmed. The Emperor protects. I responded automatically, through knowledge, vigilance. Through vigilance, survival. The words were hollow as empty shells. The morning delivery contained 11 files. I arranged them chronologically, began processing according to protocol. The 4th file was designated Delta 5312. Incident report from the Gaussian Reach, concerning Hive Fleet Hydra's approach toward a cluster of 7 agricultural worlds. Standard format, familiar content. I opened the file without particular attention, began transferring data to the processing forms. Then I saw the casualty report. Gaussian Secundus population 4,200,000. Evacuation completion rate 0%. Planetary defense minimal garrison, 3 companies Imperial Guard. Outcome total consumption. Estimated survival 0. 4,200,000 people. I had processed larger casualty numbers countless times. But something about this file penetrated the psychological armor I had constructed. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was accumulated horror finally exceeding some internal threshold. Perhaps it was the way the casualty figure was written, in careful script, precise and clinical, as if 4 million individual human lives could be adequately represented by digits on parchment. I turned to the supplementary investigation report, seeking the familiar rationalization that would explain why evacuation had not occurred, why defense had been minimal, why 4 million people had been abandoned to consumption. The report was authored by Inquisitor Matthias Crane of the Ordo Xenos. His analysis covered 47 pages of tactical assessment, strategic evaluation, resource allocation justification. On page 33, I found the explanation. It was presented in the same clinical language that characterized all inquisitorial documentation. Gaussian secundus population demographics indicate 73% non-productive classification, elderly, infirm, dependent youth, administratively redundant personnel. Agricultural output declining across 12-year trend line. Infrastructure aging beyond cost. Effective maintenance parameters. Evacuation resource requirements estimated at 17,000 troopships, 47 escort vessels, 8 months operational time. Resource allocation analysis indicates investment exceeds population utility value. Strategic assessment. Denial operation provides superior outcome. Population consumed by Tyranid advance provides negligible fleet strengthening due to majority non-optimal biomass, while resource preservation for high-value operations maintains overall strategic advantage. Recommendation: minimal defensive deployment, zero evacuation authorization, targeted infrastructure destruction to prevent Tyranid industrial resource capture. 4,200,000 people, 73%, non-productive, elderly, infirm, children, not worth the evacuation resources. More valuable dead than saved. The report continued with detailed analysis of how this decision fit into broader strategic frameworks, how similar resource allocation models had been applied across 43 other operations, how the accumulated savings in transport resources had enabled critical deployments elsewhere. The entire analysis was presented as rational optimization, as proper stewardship of limited Imperial resources. At the bottom of page 33, Inquisitor Crane had added a personal notation, apparently meant for internal inquisitorial records rather than wider distribution. I have authorized 17 similar operations across my career. Each time, I have weighed the mathematics. Limited resources measured against unlimited need. Each time, the calculation produces the same answer. We cannot save everyone. We must choose who lives based on utility rather than sentiment. I do not sleep well. I have not slept well in decades. But I sleep better than I would if I spent resources saving the unproductive and thereby allowed more valuable populations to perish for lack of transport. Someone must be willing to make these calculations. Someone must be willing to bear the weight of necessary evil. I choose to be that someone. The notation was signed, dated, sealed with his personal authentication code. It was not the confession of a monster. It was the exhausted justification of a man who had convinced himself that calculated atrocity was duty rather than crime. I sat at desk 17 with the file open before me, and something fundamental collapsed inside my psychological architecture. Not gradually, not through accumulated stress, but suddenly, catastrophically, like a load-bearing wall giving way. The careful compartmentalization I had maintained between professional duty and moral horror simply ceased to function. 4,200,000 people. I tried to visualize that number. 4 million individual humans, each with names, histories, relationships, dreams, fears. Each one as real and complex as myself. I could not visualize it. The number exceeded human cognitive capacity. It remained abstract, just digits on parchment. But I could visualize one person. I could imagine a woman, perhaps 40 years old, classified as administratively redundant, because her particular skills no longer matched current economic demands. I could imagine her standing in a settlement on Oziosian Secundus, looking at the sky as the Tyranid spores began to fall. Understanding that no evacuation was coming, that the Imperium had weighed her life against transport costs and found her wanting. I could imagine her final moments. Terror and betrayal and the awful comprehension that she had been sacrificed not through necessity, but through administrative optimization. Multiply that single imagined woman by 4,200,000. Multiply those 4,200,000 by the hundreds of similar operations documented in this archive. The math became monstrous. The scale became incomprehensible, and I had been processing these calculations for 11 years, logging them with precision and pride. Believing my thoroughness served humanity's survival, I stood abruptly, chair scraping against stone floor. Archivist Felton looked up from his work, concerned. Serath. I could not speak. I walked quickly toward the vault exit, climbed the 17 subterranean levels to the surface, emerged into the gray daylight of Cypra Mundi's eternal overcast. The air was cold, tasted of industrial particulate and promethium exhaust. I walked through the fortress courtyard, past the training grounds where Astra Militarum recruits practiced formations, past the chapel of eternal vigilance where priests led morning devotions. I walked until I reached the eastern wall, climbed the maintenance stairs to the observation platform 200 meters above the surrounding terrain. From this height, I could see the city of Castellum Mortis, spreading across the landscape, hundreds of square kilometers of habitation blocks, manufactorums, administrative centers, the immense machinery of imperial governance. 43 million people lived in this city. How many of them would be classified as administratively redundant if Tyranid fleets approached? How many would fail the utility calculations? How many would be abandoned to consumption because evacuation costs exceeded their economic value? The wind was sharp at this altitude, cut through my archive vestments like knives through parchment. I stood at the wall's edge and understood that faith was not something that could be recovered once lost. You could not unsee truth. You could not unknow what you had learned. The Imperium I had believed in, righteous necessary, humanity's only hope against the darkness, had never existed. What existed was administrative machinery optimized for control, willing to sacrifice billions to maintain power, engineering crises to justify its own absolute authority. The Tyranids were not invading the galaxy. They were locking it, creating perpetual siege conditions that made populations desperate, obedient, grateful for any protection, even as that protection selectively abandoned millions to death. The Great Devourer was not humanity's greatest threat. The Great Devourer was humanity's prison warden, and the Imperium held the keys. I do not know how long I stood on that wall. The cold became painful, then numbing, then almost pleasant in its intensity. I thought about stepping forward, about falling, about ending my complicity through the simple act of cessation. It would be easy. The fall would take perhaps 4 seconds. Impact would be instant. No more processing files. No more documenting atrocity. No more pretending that faithful service justified participation in engineered genocide. But suicide felt like cowardice. If I died, the files would still be processed. Someone else would sit at desk 17, maintain the same precision, log the same deaths. Never recognize the patterns because recognition required the particular combination of thoroughness and curiosity that had destroyed my certainty. My death would change nothing. The machinery would continue without me. I descended from the wall, returned to Vault Secundus, resumed my position at desk 17. Archivist Felton offered concerned inquiry with his eyes, but did not voice questions. I completed the processing of file Delta 5312 with perfect accuracy, logged all data in appropriate fields, sealed it for permanent storage. Then I processed 7 more files, met my daily quota, recited the noon devotional with proper reverence. That night, I made my decision. If I could not stop the machinery, I could at least bear witness. I could compile comprehensive documentation of the patterns I had discovered, create a record that future discoverers might find, ensure that the truth was preserved even if suppressed. It was inadequate, trivial compared to the scale of the crime. But it was action where suicide was surrender. I began writing, not in my work journal, which could be confiscated, but in a separate manuscript concealed in my HAB unit. I worked during night hours, documenting every pattern I had identified, every intercepted communication, every casualty report that revealed calculated abandonment rather than defensive failure. I wrote with the same precision I brought to archive processing, cited sources meticulously, built an argument through accumulated evidence rather than emotional accusation. The manuscript grew. 50 pages, 100, 200. I documented 3 centuries of Tyranid encounters, identified consistent patterns of Imperial manipulation, demonstrated through statistical analysis how casualty distributions matched optimization models rather than defensive necessity. The work consumed me. I slept 3 hours per night, lost additional weight, required increased stimulant dosages to maintain functionality. Supervisor Kadris noticed. He summoned me to his office 6 weeks after I began the manuscript. I sat across from him, accepted tea from the formal service, waited for him to speak. "You are destroying yourself," he said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes, in your deterioration. You have discovered something that you cannot accept, and it is consuming you." I said nothing. What could I say that he did not already know? Kadris sighed, removed his spectacles, cleaned them with familiar ritual. "I told you that some patterns are not meant to be assembled. I told you that questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. You did not listen. Or perhaps you could not stop yourself. Thoroughness becomes compulsion when turned toward truth. 4 million people on Gosian Secundus," I said. My voice sounded hollow, distant. Classified as non-productive. Abandoned because evacuation exceeded their economic value. Not enemy action. Not defensive failure. Administrative optimization. Kadris closed his eyes. "Yes." "You knew." "I have known for 30 years. He opened his eyes, met my gaze. "I assembled the same patterns you have discovered. I reached the same conclusions. And I chose to continue my service, because someone must maintain the archive, and I would prefer that person understand what they are documenting, rather than process files in blind ignorance." "How?" The word came out as raw anguish. "How do you continue, knowing what you know?" Kadris was silent for 43 seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried 3 decades of accumulated wariness. "Because the alternative is worse. Not the alternative of refusing service, but the alternative of the Imperium's collapse. You see the cruelty, Serath. You see the calculated sacrifice, the engineered atrocity. You are correct in everything you have discovered. But you do not see what exists outside the Imperium's borders." He stood, walked to his window, overlooking the archive's subterranean levels. "The galaxy contains horrors that make the Tyranids seem merciful by comparison. Chaos does not merely kill. It transforms, corrupts, enslaves souls to eternal torment. The Necrons do not consume. They harvest, converting living populations into mindless machines. The Orcs wage eternal war as biological imperative. Against these threats, humanity survives only through absolute unity, maintained through absolute control, justified through absolute authority." He turned to face me. "The Imperium is cruel. The Imperium sacrifices billions. The Imperium engineers crises to maintain control. But the Imperium endures. Without it, humanity fragments into 10,000 isolated civilizations that fall separately to threats that united humanity might resist. The choice is not between the Imperium and something better. The choice is between the Imperium and extinction. That's rationalization," I said. The same rationalization Inquisitor Crane used to justify abandoning Gosian Secundus. The same rationalization that justifies every atrocity necessity, survival, the greater good measured in galactic scales. Yes, Cudris agreed. It is rationalization. It is also truth. Both things can be simultaneously accurate. The Imperium is monstrous. The Imperium is also humanity's only hope. These facts do not contradict. They coexist in terrible equilibrium. He returned to his desk, sat heavily. You want simplicity, Serath. You want clear moral categories, good and evil, righteous and corrupt, justified and criminal. The universe does not offer that simplicity. The universe offers only impossible choices between different horrors and the burden of selecting which horror we will accept. I cannot accept this, I said. I cannot continue processing files, documenting genocide, participating in machinery designed to sacrifice billions while pretending it serves their protection. Then you will be removed from your position, Kadri said. His voice was not threatening, merely factual. Investigation will determine why you lost faith. Investigation will reveal your pattern analysis, your private documentation, your growing doubt. Investigation will conclude that you pose a security risk. You will be mind-wiped and reassigned to servitor duty, or you will be quietly executed, or you will simply disappear into inquisitorial custody. Your choice will not matter. The machinery will continue without you. He opened his desk drawer, withdrew a data slate, placed it before me. This contains a transfer authorization to the Administratum Census Division on Validus Prime. Quiet work, far from the archive. Processing population registration rather than casualty reports. I can authorize this transfer. Cite your exemplary service. Ensure you separate from this position with honor rather than suspicion. You will never process another Tyranid casualty file. You will never document another engineered crisis. You can serve faithfully in ignorance, the way most humans serve, unaware of the patterns that govern their existence. You would let me leave. I would prefer you leave than watch you destroy yourself. Thoroughness is valuable. Thoroughness aimed at truth is dangerous. He gestured to the data slate. This transfer represents mercy, Serath. I am offering you the opportunity to stop knowing what you know, to serve the Imperium without understanding the horror you are serving. I looked at the data slate. Transfer authorization, properly sealed, correctly formatted. Escape. A life spent processing meaningless bureaucratic forms, maintaining ignorance, never again confronting the weight of billions of calculated deaths. The temptation was physical, tangible as hunger. But accepting the transfer would mean complicity without even the dignity of comprehension. It would mean becoming the willfully blind servant, processing forms while deliberately ignoring their meaning. At least in the archive, I bore witness. At least I understood what I was documenting, could preserve that understanding even if suppressed. No, I said, I will not transfer. Kadris nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. Then you are a fool. A principled fool. But a fool nonetheless. Perhaps. But I would rather be a fool who understands than a blind servant who maintains comfortable ignorance. Understanding will destroy you, Kadris warned. You are already destroying yourself. I can see it consuming you, day by day, file by file. Eventually you will break completely, and when you break, you will be removed. The only question is whether you break quietly or publicly, whether you are eliminated as a mental health casualty or as a security threat. He was correct. I could feel the deterioration accelerating, psychological architecture crumbling under accumulated weight. Sleep had become nearly impossible. Food held no appeal. The stimulants maintained functional alertness, but could not repair the fundamental damage. I was breaking slowly and irreversibly. Then I will document what I can before I break, I said. I will preserve the truth, even if suppressed. Someone, someday, might find what I have written, might understand what I understood, might bear better witness than I have managed. Kadris looked at me with something approaching respect mixed with profound sadness. You understand that I must report this conversation. Your refusal to transfer, combined with your obvious psychological deterioration, constitutes reportable concern. Within 3 days, inquisitorial investigators will summon you for evaluation. You will not pass evaluation. Your service will end badly, Serath. And I am sorry for it. I know, I said, but I am making my choice. The Imperium offers impossible choices between different horrors. I choose the horror of bearing witness over the horror of willing blindness. I stood, bowed formally, returned to Vault Secundus. I processed 17 more files that day, worked with perfect precision despite understanding that this was my final week of service. Archivist Felton hummed his hymns. Archivist Morvain breathed softly. Everything continued normally, because everything was normal in the way the Administratum defined normal. That night, I wrote with desperate intensity. The manuscript grew to 300 pages, then 400. I documented everything: the pattern analysis, the intercepted communications, the casualty reports that revealed calculated abandonment, the philosophical framework that justified genocide through necessity. I wrote as if writing could somehow expiate my complicity, could somehow balance 11 years of faithful participation in documenting atrocity. The inquisitorial summons arrived on the 3rd day, exactly as Kadris had predicted. The courier delivered it during morning processing hours, placed the sealed parchment on my desk with bureaucratic courtesy. I opened it. Read the formal language requiring my appearance before Inquisitor Valence, Tharn for routine security evaluation. Understood that routine was euphemism for terminal. I had 1 night remaining. I spent it completing the manuscript, adding final observations, creating an index that would allow future discoverers to navigate the documentation efficiently. 547 pages, meticulously cited, arguing through accumulated evidence that the Imperium had transformed the Tyranid threat into population control mechanism operating at galactic scale. I sealed the manuscript in a waterproof container, hid it in a maintenance conduit 3 levels below my HAB unit. Perhaps it would be discovered someday. Perhaps it would be destroyed unread. The uncertainty was torture, but uncertainty was all I could offer. The evaluation occurred in a gray room in the Inquisitorial Fortress, 3 kilometers from the archive. Inquisitor Tharn was a woman of indeterminate age, face marked with scars and augmetic enhancements, eyes that had witnessed centuries of horror and become weathered by it. She did not sit behind a desk, but stood, examining me as a biologist might examine an interesting specimen. Archivist Serath Kaine, she said. Her voice was flat, emptied of everything except professional assessment. You have served faithfully for 11 years. Your supervisors report exemplary accuracy, yet you appear physically and psychologically deteriorated. Explain. I could have lied, could have blamed health issues, stress, personal grief. But lies felt like cowardice now, and I had already chosen my path. I have discovered that the Imperium manipulates Tyranid fleet movements, I said. I have documented 3 centuries of patterns demonstrating strategic guidance rather than pure defensive response. I have compiled evidence that suggests the Tyranid threat is used as population control mechanism, eliminating billions while maintaining crisis conditions that justify absolute authority. Tharn's expression did not change. No surprise, no anger, no concern. She simply nodded, as if I had confirmed an expected diagnosis. You are not the first archivist to reach these conclusions, she said. Approximately 1 in 700 archivists assembles similar patterns. Most accept transfer to positions where they will not encounter contradictory evidence. You refused transfer. Why? Because transfer means choosing willing ignorance. I cannot unknow what I know. I will not pretend comfortable blindness while the machinery continues. Nobility, Tharn said. The word carried no admiration, only neutral observation. You believe bearing witness matters. You believe documentation preserves some essential truth, even if suppressed. You believe your understanding grants you moral superiority over those who serve in ignorance. No, I said. Not superiority, just responsibility. I understand what I am complicit in. That understanding carries obligation. Tharn walked a slow circle around me, augmetic eyes clicking and whirring as they focused. I will tell you something that few outside the inner circles of the Inquisition understand. You are correct in everything you have discovered. The Imperium does manipulate Tyranid movements, does use the swarms as population control mechanism, does engineer crises to maintain absolute control. This is not corruption of Imperial ideals. This is Imperial policy, established at the highest levels of governance, maintained across millennia. Her words should have shocked me. Instead, they felt like confirmation, like the final piece sliding into place. Of course, the Inquisition knew. Of course, this was policy rather than conspiracy. The scale was too vast, the coordination too precise, for this to be anything except sanctioned strategy. Why? The question emerged as barely more than whisper. Why sacrifice billions when you could save them? Tharn stopped circling, stood before me with terrible directness. Because salvation does not scale. The Imperium controls approximately 1 million worlds, with combined populations exceeding 7 quadrillion souls. Managing those populations requires resources that do not exist. Food production cannot match reproduction rates on 300,000 worlds. Unemployment exceeds 80% on half the civilized planets. Social instability threatens constant uprising. Chaos corruption spreads through populations that have time to question, to doubt, to seek alternatives to Imperial doctrine. She gestured toward the gray walls as if they represented the entire Imperium. The Tyranids solve problems that conventional governance cannot address. They eliminate surplus populations that would otherwise starve, riot, or turn to chaos. They create perpetual crisis that unifies populations in fear, makes them grateful for any protection, prevents them from questioning why protection is necessary. They justify resource allocation to military forces that maintain internal control as much as external defense. They are, in effect, the Imperium's immune system, eliminating excess before excess becomes rebellion. That's monstrous, I said. Yes, Tharn agreed without hesitation. It is monstrous. It is also efficient, sustainable, and prevents larger catastrophes. Consider the alternative: allow populations to grow without check. Resources become insufficient. Starvation spreads. Billions die in chaotic collapse rather than organized consumption. Or attempt comprehensive economic reform. Redistribute resources. Restructure production. Optimize allocation. The administratum would require centuries to implement such changes, during which chaos would infiltrate the desperate populations, turning billions into cultists, daemons, and traitors. The choice is not between Tyranid consumption and salvation. The choice is between managed attrition and total collapse. I wanted to argue, to present some alternative she had not considered. But I was an archivist, not a strategist. I had spent 11 years processing files, not governing populations. What counterargument could I offer against her experience? Her access to information I could not imagine. There must be another way, I said, hearing the weakness in my own voice. If such a way exists, the High Lords of Terra have not discovered it across 10,000 years of governance. You are welcome to propose alternatives. Tharn's voice carried something that might have been pity. You will not. Because you understand, even if you refuse to acknowledge understanding, that the Imperium's cruelty is the minimum necessary cruelty to prevent humanity's extinction. She returned to her position before me, augmetic eyes locking onto mine with mechanical precision. I am going to explain something that will either save or destroy you. The knowledge I am about to share is classified at levels requiring Inquisitor Lord clearance. I am sharing it because you have already discovered enough to warrant your execution, and I would prefer you understand the complete picture before you die. Before I die, I repeated, not a question, an acknowledgement. You will not leave this room with your mind intact, Tharn said. Either I will perform wipe procedures that erase your memories and leave you suitable for servitor conversion, or you will choose execution. Those are your only options. But first, I will give you the gift of complete knowledge. Not mercy, knowledge. The burden of understanding why your complicity, and mine, and every Imperial servant's, is necessary. She produced a data slate from her coat, activated it with a gesture. The screen displayed a star map, showing the galaxy with colored overlays marking Tyranid fleet positions, approach vectors, consumption patterns. The Tyranids are not random swarm organisms responding to biomass scent, Tharn began. They are a directed intelligence, guided by a hive mind of vast and terrible sophistication. That much I expect you have surmised. What you do not know is how the Imperium exerts influence over that hive mind. She manipulated the data slate, zooming into specific sectors where Tyranid fleets converged. The Emperor, entombed on the Golden Throne, maintains a psychic presence that pervades the entire galaxy. That presence is humanity's beacon, the Astronomican that guides ships through the warp. But it is also more than beacon. It is the most powerful psychic entity in material space, visible to anything capable of sensing the immaterium. The data slate displayed the region around Terra, showing the Astronomican's reach extending across the galaxy like vast web of golden light. The Tyranid hive mind perceives the Astronomican. It perceives it as the most massive concentration of psychic energy in the galaxy, a feast beyond measure. Every Tyranid fleet, every splinter, every tendril is drawn toward Terra like moths toward flame. The Great Devourer does not invade the galaxy randomly. It is being pulled toward a single point, Holy Terra itself, where the Emperor's psychic presence promises consumption that would empower the hive mind beyond imagination. Horror greater than anything I had previously experienced settled over me like freezing water. The Emperor, humanity's god and savior, was bait. The Golden Throne was a lure drawing the Tyranids toward the Imperium's heart. But the Tyranids cannot reach Terra directly. Tharn continued. The galaxy is vast, the approach vectors complex, and the Imperium maintains defensive architectures specifically designed to channel, delay, and divert the swarms. We cannot stop them, but we can guide them. We can ensure they follow paths that serve Imperial strategic interests. She manipulated the display, showing how defensive positions and scorched world operations created barriers that forced Tyranid fleets into specific trajectories. Every world we burn, every population we abandon, every defensive position we establish or deliberately weaken, all of it shapes the Tyranid's approach. We are not fighting them. We are hurting them. Directing them toward populations we deem expendable, away from infrastructure we deem essential, using their hunger as a tool for population management while simultaneously slowing their advance toward Terra. This is insane, I said. You are feeding billions to the swarms to delay an advance toward Terra that you could simply end by extinguishing the Emperor's psychic presence. Tharn's expression hardened. Extinguish the Astronomican, and every human ship in the warp is lost instantly. 500,000 vessels stranded in the Imperium, crews driven mad or consumed by daemons within hours. The Imperium's infrastructure collapses. Trillions die on worlds that depend on imported food, medical supplies, military protection. Chaos spreads unchecked across a galaxy that has lost its guiding light. The Tyranids still advance, but humanity lacks the coordination to resist. The choice is not between sacrifice and safety. The choice is between managed sacrifice that preserves the Imperium's structure and unmanaged catastrophe that destroys everything. She deactivated the data slate, tucked it back into her coat. You wanted to understand the system's true nature. Now you understand. The Imperium is not evil because it deviates from proper governance. The Imperium is evil because proper governance of humanity's situation requires evil. We are trapped between Tyranid consumption, chaos corruption, and our own unsustainable population growth. The only solution is managed attrition, using the Tyranids as population control while maintaining sufficient structure to prevent total collapse. It is monstrous. It is also survival. I stood in that gray room, mind reeling from revelations that reconfigured everything I thought I understood. The Imperium was not betraying humanity. The Imperium was enacting humanity's only viable strategy in a universe designed to ensure humanity's extinction. Every file I had processed, every casualty report I had documented, every pattern I had identified, all of it was necessary evil calculated by minds far more informed than mine. But necessary evil was still evil. Managed atrocity was still atrocity. 4 million people on Gosian Secundus were still 4 million individual humans, each deserving life, each sacrificed not by enemy action, but by their own government's optimization calculations. I understand what you are telling me, I said slowly. I understand the logic, the necessity, the impossible choice between different catastrophes. But understanding does not grant acceptance. You can explain why billions must die. You cannot make those deaths righteous. No, Tharn agreed. I cannot. No one can. The deaths are not righteous. They are necessary. Righteousness is a luxury that extinct species do not require. She walked to the room's door, placed her hand on the access panel. You have two choices, Archivist Kaine. I can perform mind-wipe procedures that erase your knowledge, render you suitable for servitor conversion. You will serve the Imperium for decades, perhaps centuries, maintaining systems and processing information without consciousness of what you do. You will be useful without being burdened. Or you can refuse the procedure, in which case I will execute you immediately, cleanly, without torture or prolonged suffering. Your death will be logged as mental health casualty, unavoidable deterioration from long-term exposure to traumatic information. No shame, no heresy investigation, just quiet erasure. Those are not choices, I said. Those are different methods of ending who I am. Yes, Tharn said simply, because who you are has become incompatible with Imperial service. You understand too much and accept too little. You cannot continue as archivist because you can no longer maintain the necessary separation between documentation and judgment. So you must end, one way or another. I am offering you the dignity of choosing how. I thought about the manuscript hidden in the maintenance conduit. 540. 7 pages of careful documentation. Evidence compiled for future discoverers who might never exist. I thought about 11 years of faithful service, processing 7,000 files with perfect accuracy. I thought about Archivist Felton humming his hymns, Archivist Morvain breathing softly, Supervisor Cadris choosing to continue despite 30 years of terrible knowledge. I thought about the woman I had imagined on Gosian Secundus, watching the sky as Tyranid spores fell, understanding she had been sacrificed by administrative optimization. I thought about 4 million people. I thought about billions. I thought about the impossibility of righteousness in a universe designed to ensure humanity's extinction. Refuse mind, wipe, I said. I refuse to continue serving, even unconsciously, a system that sacrifices billions for strategic optimization. I choose execution. Tharn nodded, as if she had expected this answer. Nobility, again. You prefer death with comprehension over service, without consciousness. This is the choice most make when offered these options. Approximately 7 in 10 condemned archivists choose execution over conversion. She produced a las pistol from her coat, held it with professional familiarity. The weapon was standard inquisitorial issue, modified for clean kills rather than torture. One shot would end everything. No pain, no prolonged suffering, just sudden transition from consciousness to nothing. Do you wish to make a final statement? Tharn asked. The question seemed genuine rather than procedural. Yes, I said. I want you to know that I do not hate you. I do not think you are evil. I think you are exhausted. I think you have made terrible choices because all available choices were terrible, and you chose to bear the burden rather than pass it to another. I think you probably do not sleep well. I think you question, constantly, whether your choices are correct. I think you are more human than monster, which makes this entire situation worse than if you were simply cruel. Tharn's expression flickered. Something passed across her features. Recognition, regret. A glimpse of the person she might have been before centuries of impossible decisions transformed her into this empty instrument of necessary evil. Then the mask returned, duty reasserting itself over humanity. You are correct, she said quietly. I do not sleep well. I have not slept well in 193 years. But I continue because someone must bear this weight, and I will not pass it to another. She raised the las pistol, aimed with precision that came from long practice. For what it is worth. She added, your manuscript will not be destroyed. It will be filed in restricted archives, accessible to future inquisitors, who must learn what you have learned, understand what you have understood. Your witness will serve the Imperium, even if that service is not what you intended. The Emperor protects Archivist Kaine, even when that protection looks like execution. Through knowledge, vigilance. I responded automatically. Through vigilance, survival. The words were ritual, hollow, but they felt appropriate as final statement. I had pursued knowledge. I had maintained vigilance. And now I would die so that survival could continue for others, even if that survival required my erasure. Tharn pulled the trigger. I am dead now. I have been dead for 17 seconds, or 17 years, or 17 centuries. Time becomes ambiguous in whatever state follows execution. I do not know if what I currently experience is genuine consciousness, final neural firing patterns creating illusion of thought, or something else entirely that the Imperium's materialist dogma cannot acknowledge. But I exist, at least in this moment, at least in some form. And I can speak to you, whoever discovers this testimony, whenever you read these words that somehow persist despite my physical termination. I want you to understand several things. First, I was complicit. For 11 years, I processed files with perfect accuracy, documented atrocity while convincing myself that faithful service was righteous. I took pride in my thoroughness, believed my work mattered, never questioned whether the system I served deserved my service. My complicity was not malicious. It was faithful. That does not absolve it. Second, the Imperium is not corrupt. The Imperium is functioning exactly as designed. The cruelty you witness is not aberration but architecture. The sacrifices you document are not failures but strategy. Understanding this is worse than believing in corruption, because corruption can theoretically be purged while essential evil can only be accepted or rejected. Third, The people who maintain this system are not monsters. They are exhausted humans making impossible choices, bearing weight that would crush most minds, continuing because someone must, and they have chosen to be that someone. Hate them if you must, but understand that they hate themselves more than you ever could. Fourth, there are no good choices, only different horrors. You can serve faithfully in ignorance, documenting atrocity without comprehending its nature. You can serve faithfully with comprehension, bearing witness while maintaining complicity. You can refuse service and face erasure. Each option destroys something essential. Choose according to what you are willing to lose. Fifth, witness matters. Not because witness changes outcomes, but because someone must remember that the deaths were real. The people were individuals. The sacrifice was not abstract optimization, but billions of particular humans who deserved better than administrative calculation. Your understanding does not save anyone, but it preserves dignity that the system denies. I chose execution because I could not continue serving, even with full understanding. But I do not judge those who choose differently. Supervisor Kadris continues processing files despite 30 years of terrible knowledge. Inquisitor Tharn maintains her duty despite 193 years of sleepless nights. Their choices are not cowardice. They are different responses to impossible situation, and perhaps their continued service preserves more than my refused complicity. The manuscript exists, hidden in Maintenance Conduit 7 beneath Residential Sector 43. Find it if you can. Read it if you dare. Understand that every page was written by someone who loved their work before comprehending what that work meant. Understand that thoroughness becomes horror when turned toward truth. The Tyranids are not invading the galaxy. They are locking it, creating siege conditions that justify absolute control, eliminate surplus populations, maintain crisis that prevents questioning. The Great Devourer is humanity's prison warden, and the Imperium holds the keys. And we are all complicit, because complicity is the only form that survival takes in this particular hell. I do not know if I made the correct choice. I do not know if correct choices exist in systems where all options require accepting different forms of evil. I know only that I refused to continue participating, chose integrity over survival. Died with comprehension rather than lived with willing blindness. You who read this will make your own choice. I cannot tell you which choice is correct. I can only tell you that every choice carries weight, that no choice absolves complicity, that understanding changes nothing except the person who understands. The Emperor protects. The phrase sounds like bitter mockery now, but perhaps it contains truth. Perhaps the Emperor protects through sacrifice, through managed atrocity, through impossible calculations that preserve structure while destroying individuals. Perhaps protection requires becoming what we fear. Perhaps survival demands complicity. Perhaps I was wrong to refuse. Or perhaps the Imperium is monstrous, and the only righteous choice is refusal, and my execution was the first authentic choice I made in 11 years of faithful service. I do not know. I will never know. I am dead, and the machinery continues without me, and someone else sits at desk 17 processing files with perfect accuracy, maintaining thoroughness that may eventually destroy them as it destroyed me. Bear witness. Remember that numbers represent people. Understand that necessity does not grant righteousness. Choose according to what you can bear losing. And know that whatever choice you make, you will question whether it was correct, whether another path might have preserved something you sacrificed, whether your understanding was worth what understanding cost. I was Serath Kaine, Archivist Fourth Rank, Ordo Xenos Archive Cypher Mundi. I served faithfully for 11 years. I documented 47,000 files concerning xenological threats to the Imperium. I believed my work mattered. I discovered my work documented engineered genocide. I refused to continue. I died with comprehension rather than lived with complicity. I do not know if I was right. I know only that I made my choice, and I would make it again, and I am dead now, and the archive continues without me, and the Tyranids still advance according to patterns that someone, somewhere, continues to guide. Through knowledge, vigilance. Through vigilance, survival. Through survival, perhaps, something that might someday deserve to call itself righteousness. But not today. Not in this Imperium. Not in this galaxy. I am dead. The testimony ends. Remember me, if you can. Remember that I understood. Remember that understanding was not enough. Remember that it never is.